started very shortly. Just give everyone a couple minutes to join. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Before I get into today's topics, first things first, we are on our road to 100 subscribers, currently at 36, so we're still a ways away there, but anyone that subscribes is greatly appreciated. It's very easy to do. It costs you nothing, but it really helps me out. I'm trying to get my content out there to passionate football fans, give everyone a community where they could have fun, give their takes, hear mine, give me a bad time about mine. It doesn't matter. Just here to have fun and share my thoughts with you. To get into today's topics, couple quarterback competitions that I want to discuss, the rookie running backs that have shown flashes, as well as my bottom tier teams in the NFL. I'll be going into who I think are the worst 5 teams in the NFL going into the regular season. Again, make sure you subscribe to the channel, drop a comment. I'll be watching chat, so if you have any takes, any comments on what I'm saying, feel free to share those. Excited to interact with you in today's live show. So diving into today's topics, the first quarterback competition that I really want to discuss, and funny enough, I don't really think that a lot of people saw it as a quarterback competition when going into this season, but I think these quarterbacks have proven that they both want to be the starter, and specifically I'm talking about Jaxson Dart and Russel Wilson of the New York Giants. Jaxson Dart was a first-round pick this year for the New York Giants, and Russel Wilson, really a staple of the NFL for a long time, was most prolific with his time in the Seahawks, has sort of become a journeyman late in his career with a short stint in Denver, as well as an even shorter stint in Pittsburgh, and now he is slotted currently as the starting quarterback for the New York Giants. Now, a couple reasons why I want to discuss this, and I know I've done videos on Jaxson Dart in the past, but really I think a big aspect of that and the reason why I continue to talk about him is he continues to impress, right? He had a really good first preseason game of his rookie year, and he seems to have followed that up with an even more impressive season, or an even more impressive performance, I should say, in the most recent preseason game. So diving into that a little bit further, Jaxson Dart in his second preseason game went for 14 of 16 for 137 yards and 1 touchdown, right? So in one preseason game, 14 of 16 for 137 yards and 1 touchdown. That's a quarterback rating of 123.2, which to me is a really impressive quarterback rating. And not to mention, he also ran a touchdown in a quarterback sneak in this game. So he actually totaled 2 touchdowns in this game. Now, to talk a little bit more about Russel Wilson went 4 for 7 for 108 yards. And part of that was one of his signature Russel Wilson deep balls. It was a perfect pass, and it was right on the money. Almost got a touchdown. The wide receiver actually got tackled right before the end zone. Unfortunately for Russell, he did throw 1 interception in this game. But again, in a preseason game, generally at his level, you're trying things, you're taking shots you might not normally always take. But for me, he had a solid game as well. And so, if I'm a Giants fan, I'm looking at this situation, and the first things I'm thinking to myself are, where do I think the Giants are going to end up this year, right? How good can the New York Giants be in the 2025 season? And I think a lot of that has to do with what happens at the quarterback position, right? Jaxson Dart, again, he's a rookie, but he's already shown flashes and shown poise that he can play in the NFL, and play pretty soon, right? I think a lot of people going into this season were expecting Russell Wilson to be the starter outright. And I think at a bare minimum, people were expecting Russell Wilson to be the starter for at least the first 4 to 8 games of this year, while Jaxson Dart got acclimated to the NFL. Again, in these preseason games, and I will say it is with a caveat, it is a preseason game. Jaxson Dart has already shown me that he can be a starting quarterback in this league, right? Jaxson Dart has shown me he can be a starting quarterback in this league. And so a big part of that, again, is his poise, his ability to move the ball down the field on a very regular basis and at an accurate rate, right? 14 of 16 is very impressive, especially for a rookie quarterback. You might see, that sort of completion percentage at a shorter clip, right? If someone's passing, 10 times in a game, but 16 passes in a game, I'm not saying that's like a full game's worth of passing, but at the same time, he only had 2 incompletions. That's very impressive. And so, to me, again, going back to what I was saying, you got to ask yourself as a Giants fan, what do I really expect from my team, and what am I looking for moving forward as a Giants fan? And I think the honest answer that any Giants fan would tell you is, they're still in a rebuilding phase. But I also think at the same time, they've done a lot to make sure that they are going to be a competitive team. I've mentioned this before. I don't think the Giants have a chance at the playoffs this year purely because they're in the NFC East and they have the Commanders as well as the Eagles to compete with. Not to mention, the Cowboys could potentially surprise some people. If Micah Parsons is out there, I don't think they stand a chance. But regardless, the Commanders and the Eagles are really good. And that's sort of why I've always slated the Giants as a team that isn't going to be a playoff contender, but they could ruin the hopes of other playoff teams, right? I could see them, sending some people home, sending some people to Cabo, as the players like to say, early, because of the fact that they do have a lot of talent on this roster, right? More specifically, they have a lot of talent on the roster on the defensive end, right? I think their edge rush could potentially become the best edge rush in the NFL. You have Brian Burns, you have Abdul Carter, you have Kayvon Thibodeau, right? You have these great young edge rushers that could disrupt any prolific offense, right? That's a huge aspect of this. It doesn't matter how good your offense is if your quarterback can't hold on to the ball because he's too busy getting sacked, right? That's going to be a huge aspect of this. And so on top of that, if they can get production at the quarterback position, that's going to be a huge factor for this team, right? They have a solid wide receiver in Malik Nabers, right? Malik Nabers had over 1,200 yards last year as a rookie, and that was with a pretty rough, passing game last year, right? And so if you were to add someone like a Jaxson Dart or a Russell Wilson that can throw the ball to Malik Nabers, I think you're going to see a lot more production out of him. So that's a big aspect of this. Again, going into this, for me, based off of the performance I've seen from both of these teams and both of these players, I should say, the performance of both Jaxson Dart and Russell Wilson, I struggle to see Russell Wilson staying on the field longer than 4 games. Not because Russell Wilson isn't playing well. Again, I think Russell Wilson will perform. I think it's because the New York Giants should be looking to the future, and Jaxson Dart clearly is the future of this New York Giants team. I don't think there's anyone in New York that's thinking Russell Wilson is the answer to any of the Giants' problems. And so when you invest a first-round pick into a quarterback, you are going to want to take advantage and utilize that investment. And so to me, I don't see Jaxson Dart sitting more than 4 games in this regular season before he becomes the full-time starter. A little bit of a caveat on this is, and the reason why I don't think you start Jaxson Dart right away is the fact that he is a young quarterback. And a lot of times with being a young quarterback, you have to toe the line when it comes to confidence, right? I think the Giants can show and tell Jaxson Dart they trust him and they see him as the future quarterback without starting him right away, right? It could be a huge advantage to Jaxson Dart to sit behind Russell Wilson for the first couple games just to get his feet acclimated, understand what it's like in the NFL, You know, right now it's the preseason. He's not necessarily seeing first team defenses quite yet. So there's a whole nother level that he's going to have to get used to. And so if he can take a couple games on the sidelines, see how Russell Wilson operates, how the offense operates, and be able to understand what sort of adjustments he's going to need to make, that could be a crucial part of Jaxson Dart's start of his career. A lot of times there's a lot of pressure to start first round picks, especially quarterbacks when you draft them in the NFL. I think of players like I think of a lot of players like we'll go with Drake May, we'll go with Jaden Daniels, we'll go with Caleb Williams of last year, right? Drake May didn't start right away, but there was still a lot of pressure for him to start over Brissett for the New England Patriots. Caleb Williams was handed the keys to the car immediately for Chicago, and he had a good season. He had a really good rookie season, but the Browns didn't have the outcome they were looking for, and Caleb Williams had a stellar performance yesterday in the second preseason game for the Chicago Bears, and I think a lot of Bears fans are excited moving forward. But there was a lot of questions about how he and Ben Johnson would get along. And again, I say all this to say, generally it's really hard to get up and running as a rookie quarterback in the NFL, especially on a team that has struggled in the past, right? I don't think there's a single quarterback right now that wishes they're in Cam Ward's shoes. And I say that sort of lightly, right? I think a lot of people would want to be the first pick in the draft and be a starter, but at the same time, he's in a tough situation, right? He's got a pretty weak receiving core. His team struggled. That's why they had the first pick in the draft. And so again, sitting behind someone like a Russell Wilson that you can learn from could be a huge advantage for Jaxson Dart. I think of quarterbacks like Aaron Rodgers, right? Jordan Love. The Packers have done a great job of doing this, where they give their quarterbacks time to get acclimated and get comfortable in the NFL and continue to progress, right? I think it would be smart for the Giants. I'm not saying to hold him out for the entire year, but at least give him a couple games so that he can get a sense for what a real NFL game is like. And so for me, again, I see Russell Wilson starting the season, but I don't see Russell Wilson playing more than 4 games as the starter for the Giants this year. The next quarterback competition I want to talk about, and maybe this is just in my head as a quarterback competition, but to me, I think this is important to discuss because of Matt Stafford's back. Matt Stafford's back continues to linger. I reported on this last week. He was supposed to return to practice last week, but has still unable to do that, right? Matt Stafford got an epidural in his back like 2 weeks ago, and they considered him week to week. And as recently as today, there are still no conversations about Matt Stafford returning soon. Again, Matt Stafford's 37 years old, and back injuries linger. And so if this is what it's like now, what's going to happen when he starts getting hit by 300-pound defensive linemen? What's it going to look like when suddenly Nick Bosa comes off the edge and hits him in the back, right? How is his back going to handle that? It's a 17-game season now. And so for me, I don't trust Matt Stafford to be there for 17 games. I really don't. Sadly, right? I think the Rams are projected to be a playoff team and sometimes even considered a Super Bowl contender because of their prolific offense. Sean McVay as a great head coach, and the fact that they added a wide receiver like Davante Adams, right? But again, Matt Stafford's older. He's fought through a lot already in his career, and I know he's known as a tough quarterback, but he still isn't practicing. And again, having an epidural is a major thing. I don't think people realize how bad it must have been for him to get an epidural. And so for me, I don't think this is going to be a season where we see Matt Stafford for 17 games. At this point, I'd be surprised if we see him for half of the season. Again, I think he's going to do his best. He's a really tough quarterback, but this injury lingers. and anything could re-aggravate it on a week-by-week basis. And so I really do think this is going to be a lingering issue for the Rams. And so for me, I want to talk about Stetson Bennett and Jimmy Garoppolo. And there's a couple things that I first need to say before we really dive into this too far. The first being Stetson Bennett has been the sole quarterback that has played for the Rams this entire preseason. Jimmy Garoppolo, who's I'm assuming slotted as the second quarterback, hasn't played in a single preseason game. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's considered to be a proven quarterback, even though to me, he hasn't really proved a lot, especially in the last couple years. If I'm looking at Jimmy Garoppolo's stats over the last four years, right? His last 2 years in San Francisco, his 2021 was his best season, right? He had 3,800 yards, 20 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions. Last year he played in one game. He was 27 for 41. He had 334 yards for 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. That's a good performance. But again, he only played in one game. And for me, I find it odd that they've only played Stetson Bennett. Stetson Bennett, he is a small quarterback, right? And I think that's his biggest downfall. That's probably the only reason why, he isn't considered to be a starting quarterback in this NFL. But at the same time, you have to imagine that he's outperforming Jimmy Garoppolo. If I'm Jimmy Garoppolo, I probably want to prove myself a little bit in some of these preseason games because, you're looking at the performance of Stetson Bennett in the last game, right? He threw for 324 yards and 3 touchdowns on a 70% completion percentage. He's got 512 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions in the preseason. And again, he had a stellar performance last week or this past preseason game against the Chargers. They won the game in exciting fashion at the end of this game. And I think the Rams are seriously considering Stetson Bennett as that true number 2 quarterback for this team because again, if you are Jimmy Garoppolo, I know you're a little bit of an older quarterback and more proven. You're not getting those reps right now, and Stetson Bennett is getting those reps, and he's taking advantage of that. And right now, with Matt Stafford being injured, not necessarily touching the field, not even the practice field, I am confident that Sean McVay is looking at Stetson Bennett right now as the potential starter if Matt Stafford isn't able to join the team anytime soon, right? Again, you still have a couple weeks left until the regular season, but at the same time, you have to get the connection between your quarterback and the line and the receivers as early as possible. And Stetson Bennett seems to have that connection with these players so far. So again, that's why I'm really curious to see what happens with the quarterbacks competition. And again, maybe it's just me calling it a competition, but I really do think that the Rams should seriously consider this because you are looking at a quarterback that is a national champion, right? He's been a performer in big moments. He's proven that. Again, his biggest issue is his size. That is definitely something that needs to be considered in all of this. Because when you look at it, preseason game 1, he had 188 yards for 2 touchdowns and he had 1 interception. Last game, 324 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. He outthrew the Chargers by over 100 yards yesterday, right? That's a pretty significant number. And so for me, again, you have to consider that when you're thinking about the Rams quarterback situation because the last thing I'll mention, and I know this isn't a huge deal, maybe this is just like an innocent bystander fan seeing this, but I'm thinking back to the relationship between Jimmy Garoppolo and Davante Adams in Las Vegas, right? After Derek Carr left, Jimmy Garoppolo became the starting quarterback, and Davante Adams did not enjoy that time, right? There's a clip of Davante Adams saying, "I need to get the hell out of here before I get killed." And that's because Jimmy Garoppolo was putting him into terrible situations where he was catching the ball in traffic and getting hit immediately. And I can tell you right now, if Sean McVay were to ask Devontae Adams, hey, who would you rather have throwing you the ball right now? I'm pretty confident it would not be Jimmy Garoppolo. I'm pretty sure Devontae Adams would say, put Stetson out there. He's proven himself. So again, I'm not sure if this is as real as I think it is as a quarterback competition, but I really do think you should be paying attention to what Stetson Bennett is doing in Los Angeles. Now I talked about wanting to get into some rookie running backs, right? And for me specifically, the two rookie running backs that I want to discuss are Treyeveon Henderson and Ashton Jeanty. Now, Treyeveon Henderson, he was a second round pick for the Patriots, and Ashton Jeanty was the first running back taken off the board for the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, Treyeveon Henderson's probably biggest play wasn't this past weekend, right? His biggest play was in week one, and it was probably the talk around New England where Treyeveon Henderson returned a kick for a 100-yard touchdown, right? It was an explosive play, and that's what Treyeveon Henderson was known for at Ohio State, right? He was a dual running back duo with Judkins last year, right? Judkins was much more of the downhill running back, whereas Treyeveon Henderson was the change of speed, quick burst, big play running back. He had a huge college football playoff performance in all of those games, and I think for me, Treyeveon Henderson, again, he only had one carry in week one, but it was for 18 yards. And week two, he had four carries for 5 yards and one touchdown, right? So that's 5 yards a carry. Any team is going to be excited about 5 yards a carry. Generally the number is four, right? If you are averaging 4 yards a carry as a running back, that is someone that is a starting caliber running back. And so for me, Treyeveon Henderson needs to be talked about more as someone that could be an impact player going into this season. They matched him up with Drake May, second year quarterback for the Patriots. And, they have a brand new coach, Mike Vrabel, who is a great coach. He's experienced. I'm not saying he's a brand new coach overall. He's a brand new coach to the Patriots. But Treyeveon Henderson should expect to see the ball early and often. Mike Vrabel, he was the head coach for the Tennessee Titans. Who was the running back there? It was Derrick Henry. And Derrick Henry ran the ball more than any other running back in the NFL. If you were to look at the amount of carries that Derrick Henry has compared to any other running back in the last 5 years, it's not even close to how many carries he's gotten, right? He is the number one running back from that perspective by far. And so again, Treyeveon Henderson needs to be talked about more as someone that could impact this Patriots team. The AFC East, you have the Patriots, the Dolphins, you have the Jets, and the Bills. And really, this is the Bills division, right? It has been for a couple of years. But the Patriots have the ability to make a little bit of a comeback and have more of a splash this year. I don't think the Jets are really expected to do much this year. I think they'll be a solid team, but with Justin Fields at their quarterback, I think their ceiling is somewhere around 500, if I'm being realistic. And the Dolphins have an exciting roster, but they haven't been able to put it together yet, right? Mike McDaniel, I think a lot of people love him as a head coach, but if there's anything that's been proven out of his tenure with Miami, it's he's really struggled to actually develop a culture of success there, right? Tyreek Hill, as recently as the end of last season, wanted to get out of there, and I know he's backtracking his words, and he's talked about how that's not necessarily the case anymore, but no one seems to be a big fan of him in Miami, but I also don't think they know how to get rid of him because of the fact that he's getting paid as much as he is. So again, I say all this to say the Patriots have a good opportunity to really improve this year, and I think Treyeveon Henderson could be a huge aspect of that performance, like and of that success. He could definitely become a staple running back in the NFL this year. Right now, I'm regretting not drafting him in my fantasy league. Again, the second running back I want to discuss is Ashton Jeanty, right? And I apologize for not discussing him first, but to me, Ashton Jeanty, there's a lot that comes with being the first running back taken, right? There's a lot of pressure right now for running backs to perform. As recently as like 2 years ago, there was a huge drop off in demand as well as what running backs were getting paid. I think that's sort of recovered recently, but at the same time, Ashton Jeanty is in a position where he could become, a marquee running back in this league. He's on an offense that I think will be a run first offense, right? You have Geno Smith as your quarterback, and Geno Smith doesn't necessarily have, the top weapons out there. His best weapon is actually a second year tight end, Brock Bowers out of Georgia, right? I think that's really the main weapon on the passing side for the Las Vegas Raiders. And so Ashton Jeanty has the ability to be a huge impact on this team and in the league. And to kind of talk about what he's done so far, right? I think he had a really rough week one, but he really bounced back. And the week one, I think he had 3 carries for like -1 yards, right? No one wants to have that sort of performance. Again, it was only 3 carries, but when you get negative yardage, you're not going to be happy with that. But again, he bounced back this week, and I think the 49ers really noticed that. First things first, I think if you were to give an Uno reverse card for welcome to the league moments, Lenore, the safety for the 49ers, he got truck sticked by Ashton Jeanty. That was a clip. Everyone who is focusing or paying attention to the NFL has seen what Ashton Jeanty did in that preseason game, and it was a huge aspect of what he was able to, that play was a huge aspect of what he was able to do in that preseason game. He had 7 carries for 33 yards and 1 touchdown. Again, that 13-yard run where he absolutely truck sticked Lenore was the talk around town. And for me, again, I think it's going to be important to see how he actually handles the regular season. But also, the Las Vegas Raiders should be happy about what they saw out of him this week, right? And I think I don't know if we'll see Ashton Jeanty in the third preseason game. They might try to save his legs and get him ready for week one, but I do expect him to get the ball early and often in week one for the Las Vegas Raiders. All right, the last topic I wanted to discuss today, but I think it's more of a fun one, is the 5 teams that I see being the worst teams heading into the regular season. Now, there's probably going to be, a couple surprises here, but I think some of these are pretty self-explanatory as well. I'll actually probably start with who I see being like the fifth to last team in the NFL, if that makes sense. And then I'll go to who I think to be the worst team, right? And so, again, I'm talking about the bottom 5 teams, in my opinion, going into this season. And the fifth worst team for me is going to be the Jacksonville Jaguars. They were a bottom 5 team last year in both total offense and defense, right? That alone is self-explanatory, right? They just paid Trevor Lawrence. They gave him a huge contract. He was the highest paid quarterback at that time, highest paid player at the time of his contract. And again, they were bottom 5 in the league last year in total offense. They went 4-13 in what I would consider to be a terrible division, right? If you look at the AFC, the worst division by far is the AFC South, right? You have the Indianapolis Colts, you have the Jacksonville Jaguars, you have the Tennessee Titans, and then you have the Houston Texans. Now, the Texans have separated themselves by far in that division, but there's really 2 teams at the bottom of that list that I think are competing to be the worst team in this league. They averaged 18.8 points a game last year, while giving up 25.6 points per game. right? That's a huge disparity. That's essentially saying their opponents score a touchdown more than them every single game. That's not going to get you anywhere. I will say they revamped their offensive line, but they also lost weapons like Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis. And I know that they added Travis Hunter, and they're hoping that Travis Hunter will be, a first off a shutdown corner, but they also are looking for him to be like their wide receiver too, right? I don't think they're like thinking he's wide receiver one. Brian Thomas I think has really proven that for them, right? And I think that's why they were probably willing to give up Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis. But at the same time, you're depending on Travis Hunter, who is also going to be playing cornerback, to be that wide receiver too. And so I think this puts the Jacksonville Jaguars in a really tough position. Travis Hunter might shock us all, right? I really hope he does. But I think there's a lot of players out there wondering, like, how is he going to be able to sustain playing both offense and defense for the Jacksonville Jaguars this season? I think that's going to be a huge tell. But until I see him in a couple of games being able to be out there regularly on both sides, I consider the Jacksonville Jaguars to be the fifth worst team in the NFL this year. The fourth team, I don't think this one's going to be a shocker to anyone, but to me, it has to be the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns, maybe I even should have had them even higher on this list, but to me, the Cleveland Browns, I think, are going to be really bad this year, and there's a couple reasons for that. One, and first and foremost, it's the fact that they're just such a poorly run organization. That's their biggest Achilles heel, is the fact that they have terrible ownership and management of this team. They make terrible decision after terrible decision, right? Letting Nick Chubb walk is a perfect example of that. I think people like to talk about the Deshaun Watson contract and that decision, the trade they made, but to me, letting Nick Chubb walk is an even worse decision by the Browns. Not because of performance, but because of culture. Again, I said this before. They're a poorly run organization, and so they have a terrible culture, right? Myles Garrett wanted out, right? He wanted to leave, but they paid him, and they paid him more than probably Myles Garrett expected. The next highest paid edge rusher was around $35 million a year. I think it was like $36 million a year. They gave Myles Garrett $40 million a year so that he would stay. He had requested a trade, and now is their only way of getting him to stay. It's exactly what they did to Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson didn't want to go to Cleveland even, but they put a contract in front of him that he couldn't say no to. And that's what Cleveland does to try to fix problems. That's their way of getting people to go to Cleveland, is just overpaying them. And so for me, that track record of making bad decisions is a huge aspect of that. The other aspect of this is they were dead last in offense last year. They averaged 15.2 points a game, right? So 15 points a game. So they had a little bit more than 2 touchdowns per game, right? It was by far the worst offense in the league. And what they've done to change that is they've added Joe Flacco from Indianapolis, and then they drafted a quarterback in the 3rd round and another one in the 5th, right? Joe Flacco, he's 40 years old. He's generally really good, and he can put together a solid 2 to 3 game stretch, but there is a fall off for Joe Flacco. He's known for that, right? He will start for a team, after a starting quarterback gets injured. He'll come in and replace someone, and he'll have like a stellar performance or two, but generally there's a drop off soon after that. And so for me, I don't think you can just trust Joe Flacco to be the starter for the entire season. You're going to be depending on probably either Dylan Gabriel or Shedeur Sanders. I don't see Kenny Pickett making this team because of how Shedeur Sanders and Dylan Gabriel have done in the preseason. They're younger quarterbacks. Who Kenny Pickett is. I've heard NFL executives even say he is not an NFL caliber quarterback. I think he's really still in the league because he was a 1st round pick, and generally they get a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt when it comes to sticking around. And so again, it's going to come down to probably Dylan Gabriel or Shedeur Sanders as the starter late in this season, because there's not going to be a real point to playing Joe Flacco 17 games anyway, right? I don't think they're going to be more than a 5-win team this year, right? That's their ceiling in my opinion. And so what's the point of starting a 40-year-old quarterback for that, right? Let's look at the future and see what you have, because in the end, the Cleveland Browns are going to be in position to draft a quarterback next year. And so that's really what they need to be looking at. The other aspect of this is who knows when Quinshon Judkins is going to be able to play, or when he's going to be up to speed to play for the Browns, right? Quinshon Judkins still isn't signed by the Cleveland Browns, their second-round pick, because of a domestic violence situation, right? They're no longer going to press charges against him. But again, Quinshon Judkins hasn't been to practice for the Cleveland Browns. He hasn't even signed his contract. And so, again, perfect example of the Browns making a terrible decision, letting Nick Chubb leave. But I don't know what to expect out of their run game this season, because to me, Jerome Ford is not the answer for that. I don't really know how they're going to move the ball down the field this year. They're really going to rely on Myles Garrett and some of their defenders to be their offense. They're going to need them to get points on the board, because all you really have on the offense for the Browns is Jerry Jeudy. All right, so going to this one might be a little bit of a shocker to people, and you can call me a hater if you want, but at the same time, to me, I see the Arizona Cardinals being a bottom tier team this year in the NFL. To me, the Cardinals' ceiling could be the highest of any of these teams, but I think their floor is just as low as any of them. And to me, a lot of that has to do with Kyler Murray, right? Kyler Murray is an anomaly in my opinion. I think he has the ability to play at an MVP level, but he's also super inconsistent at the same time, right? He had 3 games last year of over 300 passing yards, but then he also had 5 games last year where he threw the ball under 200 passing yards, right? And a big reason for that is because of his inconsistency. They if you were to look at statistically the Cardinals on a regular basis, right, from an offensive perspective and a defensive perspective, they're in the middle of the pack on both sides, right? They're probably 15th in offense, and they're right around 16, 17 when it comes to total defense last year. And so when you think about that, you have to wonder, like, how are they one of the worst teams? It's purely because of inconsistency. And then the other aspect of this is the fact that they're in a tough division now, right? I think the NFC West, I talked about the Rams earlier. I think they're a better team than the Cardinals this year. I would definitely put Seattle ahead of them, as well as the 49ers, right? I do see the Cardinals being last place in the NFC West this year. And I'm not exactly sure if there was any key additions that really helped them out this year at the same time. I think that's a big aspect of that. They let several of their offensive line walk this past season. And really they drafted like one guard, but they didn't really add anyone else on the offensive line. And for Kyler Murray, if you want him to stay healthy, if you want him to stay up and be able to pass the ball down the field, he has to have time. He can scramble, he can run the ball, but that hasn't proven to turn into wins for this Arizona Cardinals team. So for me, I see them taking a big drop this year. I think they are going to be a bottom tier team in the NFL this year. Number 2 on this list. I think the next 2 are pretty obvious, so I probably won't have to hammer in on these too much, but the Tennessee Titans I see being like the second worst team, even potentially, the worst team in the NFL. But like I'm sorry, Cam, but like regardless of you thinking you have a top 5 wide receiver core in the NFL, you don't. They have a lower tier run game. They were 3rd lowest when it came to sacks last year. They were 2nd to last in turnover ratio, and they were bottom 3 in offense and defense last year, right? They had a bottom 3 defense, and they gave up the 3rd most points on the defensive side. They did improve their offensive line and QB, but I don't think it's going to be enough this year. I think Cam Ward is going to struggle more than people would like to see. And I don't think a lot of that has to do with him. I think it has to do with the fact that he doesn't have the weapons around him. Tajay Spears, I think, would be a serviceable running back anywhere else. He would be a solid number 2, maybe even number 3 running back on certain rosters. But he's not a starter, and they're really expecting him to be that for them. And then again, their wide receiver core. I think Calvin Ridley is a solid wide receiver. I think he could even be considered a good wide receiver. But there's a huge drop off after that. Like Van Jefferson, I think took a huge brunt of what happened in the preseason game. Cam Ward was like 2 for 7 for 34 yards. He had one really long pass that was an impressive pass, but he had his receivers were dropping the ball left and right for him, and I think that's going to be a common theme in the regular season. I see them being dead last in a really bad AFC South, right? I think the Jacksonville Jaguars will have a better record than the Tennessee Titans. I definitely see Indianapolis as well as the Texans having a better record as well. And so for me, I really do see the Titans being second to last, and I see them having like the number 1 or number 2 pick in the draft next year, and hopefully picking up a player that can help turn this franchise around along with Cam Ward. Because again, I'm not putting this on Cam Ward. I don't think he's going to be a flop or a bust by any means, but I also don't think he's going to be the reason why they turn the. I don't see him being the reason why they turn the franchise around. I don't see him being like Joe Burrow was for the Cincinnati Bengals by any means. So that's why I really have the Titans as the second worst team in the league this year. Now, the last team, the worst team I see in the NFL this season, and again, I don't think anyone will really see this as a surprise, but it is the New Orleans Saints. The New Orleans Saints somehow still find themselves in salary cap prison from Michael Thomas and Drew Brees. Now, I won't go too far into those details, but essentially they just kept kicking the can down the road when it came to money that they owed those players. And they're still paying those players, and it's really impacted their salary cap, and it's a huge reason why they're right now trying to figure out if Spencer Rattler or Tyler Shough will be the starting quarterback for the Saints this year. They were a lower tier offense last year, and a big aspect of that, and the scary part of this is the fact that they also had a more proven quarterback last year too. Like Derek Carr, I wouldn't say had a great season, but at the same time, he's a much better quarterback than Tyler Shough or Spencer Rattler, right? And I don't see them improving this year, right? The other aspect of this is Alvin Kamara isn't getting any younger, right? Alvin Kamara is starting to get up there in age. He's super consistent. He's a great playmaker, but how much can you really depend on Alvin Kamara to really produce time after time? Again, he's getting up there in age, and I'm going to pull up his stats really quick for you just to kind of dive into this a little bit. But he's 30 years old. He had 950 yards rushing last season and 6 touchdowns. That is not necessarily going to win you a lot of games. It was an uptick from his prior season, but again, he's getting older, right? He did have 543 receiving yards as well on top of that. But they like to say generally running backs hit a wall at 30. I know there's some running backs that have been sort of an anomaly in that perspective. I'm thinking like Adrian Peterson a while back, and then also as recently Derrick Henry. But Alvin Kamara is not necessarily built like a Derrick Henry, right? He's a quick, shifty running back. He shows patience, which I think is super helpful and can prolong his career because he's really smart about waiting for the holes to open up for him. But at the same time, if you're going to be getting 200 plus carries on a regular basis at the age of 30, there's going to be a lot of wear and tear on you. And I just don't see the Saints being able to depend on someone like Alvin Kamara to win them games time after time. I really do see the Saints winning potentially 3 games this year. I think 3 games is probably going to be what Saints fans should expect, and I'll put 4 or 5 games as the ceiling. I think that's the top that you're going to really see because the NFC South has improved, right? I think Bryce Young has gotten to a flow at the end of last season, which really helped out the Panthers. I think the Buccaneers found a quarterback in Baker Mayfield. That's really helped them out. And then you also have the Atlanta Falcons. Atlanta Falcons, they haven't even played Michael Penix in a preseason game, right? He's a second-year quarterback. He played in 4 games last year, and he's not even playing in games right now because they're so confident that he's going to perform this year. He has great weapons around him. They have a solid defense, and so to me, I don't know if they'll be able to win more than 1 game in their division. I see them splitting with the Panthers, but I don't see them being able to win a single game against Atlanta or Tampa Bay. And so again, I really do think that the Saints will have the number 1 pick next season, and they're hoping that Archie Manning will be going into the draft. Right now he's saying he's not. I think that's more of an insurance policy, but again, I do see the Saints ending the season dead last and probably trying to find their next franchise quarterback. So that's really all I wanted to cover today. Let me know what you think of these topics. Any other topics you'd like me to discuss this week? Happy to get into those. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.